Hello all and welcome to round 2 with this gang. If you are joining us for the first time, we'll introduce ourselves in just a second. If you are joining us for the second time, welcome back. I'm just going to go through a couple of house rules before we get started so that you can see what we're doing here. Please make sure that you ask questions in the chat box on the right there. You can see people are already saying hello, so you can feel free to ask any questions as we go along in that chat box. If you drop out for any reason, you can log back in anytime via the email link. And if you can't hear us, try to log out and log back in again. Sometimes you have audio issues, as is the world of technology, but you can always try to go back in and out. And if you're having spotty internet, a replay is available and will be sent to you 24 hours after this session and is available for 5 days. We had feedback last time that you can't fast forward and rewind through that replay, so that's kind of annoying, and I know that. So we'll be also putting the video on TheatreArtLife within the next day so that you can also watch it like a normal YouTube video and that sort of thing. Okay, so welcome to everybody, and to kick off we thought we'd start something a little bit fun. So what I'd like each of our panel members to do is just to introduce themselves and then share with the group their most favourite or most memorable show stop that they've experienced. So who would like to go first? Or should I just nominate you?
Yeah, maybe that's probably easy.
Who's going to be first up? Let's go with Dean. Oh, we can't hear you, Dean.
Did you mute yourself, Dino?
No, he didn't. Why do we always have that at the start of every session?
It's always the first one.
I know, it's so funny. So we're going to start with Rex while Dean gets himself sorted out over in that corner.
He's popped off. Rex. I think he's... okay, so I am currently living in Melbourne. I'm currently the deputy stage manager on the Australian production of Harry Potter. I'm very new. Only did 3 weeks before we shut down. So it's exciting. A lot to learn yet. Okay, so my favourite show stop on House of Dancing Water. As a show caller, I don't know that you'd ever call it your favourite. The one I remember the most is when the giraffe fell in the pool. It was just a totally unexpected thing. We had discussed it, we had planned for it, but not where they had fallen in the pool. So the giraffe being a puppeteer, 2 artists in a puppet.
Fantastic.
I've got like 1,000 others because I was a showstop queen for a long time, but that one will do.
All right, Dino. Yeah, we can hear you. Go for it.
Okay, good. Yeah, that happened last time too. Yeah, I'm Dean. I'm currently the general stage manager on Lucia for Cirque du Soleil. I'm in Toronto. Lucia is on hiatus, obviously. We got to Moscow, bumped the show in with our crew, and then made the call as soon as the actual bumping was complete, and tore it all down again, sent everybody home over the next week. And yeah, we're all currently all around the world, and yeah, waiting for the next step of that one. My favourite, I've got 2, a few actually. At House, my favourite showstop was the, not favourite showstop again, you know, it's one that's really memorable, was during Cage Dive, we had a full blackout with 2 performers hanging on the end of a cage. We got the cage to about, I think it was going up to the last or the second last height, 5 to 7 meters, somewhere around that height. And we had a full blackout. So they're just hanging there over a completely black pool. We send divers in with torches just to give them some kind of reference of where the pool is underneath them. So if they do fall, they can fall actually into the pool. It took a few seconds for the emergency lights to come on, and eventually we finally got the show back, got the power back, and were able to get them back off the cage. But it took a little while. I remember my first show stop really clearly. I was thinking about that the other night. I was calling Phantom, and it was literally like the second or third time I'd ever called a show. It was a huge show. I was completely out of my depth. My stage manager, Annika Harrison, was standing behind me while I was fluffing my way through this musical. And
we both did that, Dean.
I'm 21 years old. And it's the first show call. It's my first ever show call. And I was shaking so hard that my legs were shaking, like my arms were shaking, could barely turn the page onto the next piece of music or operate a cue light. It was crazy. But someone fell. Sharon Millichip, who was our young Meg, fell from the portcullis in the final scene, and they had these abseiling ascenders on, but the ascender didn't grab, and she fell to the deck. I had my hands on the cue lights, and the next thing I knew, I was in exactly the same position, but standing the other way behind Anna, and she had literally picked me up and moved me behind her and stepped into the call. I didn't even realize what was going on. She was, not a huge woman either. She just picked me right up, and I was out of the way, just adrenaline. And there you go. That was my first.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Mads.
Hello, I'm Madison. I'm currently on the Gold Coast in Australia. I spent some time in Macau and Las Vegas, and now I've been back touring musicals in Australia, most recently finishing up with School of Rock. I have so many as well. I mean, you can't work on these kind of shows and not have many. I think I have two big ones. One was at House, where as we'll talk about a little bit later, there's a moto act in the show. And it's, obviously that's a big one. But this particular instance, it was literally the end of the act, and they go up to the end of the stage and then they turn around and come back down stage. But the one on the side went a bit too far to the side where the open pool is, and basically turned his bike into the pool. Thankfully, he was perfectly fine. The bike was actually mostly fine, and it was out of the way enough that we could continue, but it took us a little second to work out that we were good to carry on. But I can just remember the motor guy like clinging to the edge of the stage like a drowned cat, waiting to be like helped out. So that one was pretty funny. And then probably more recently in musical time, when I first came back to Australia, I did a show called American Idiot that has a flying sequence in it. And I mean, I spent years doing House, so I was used to that kind of flying sequence. But I was one of the stage managers on the deck, and it was like our opening show in Sydney in the concert hall, with like a massive audience. And there was an issue with the flying rig, which meant that we had to de-rig the girl in the middle of the act on stage. And I was the person that got sent out to do it, like in the middle of the entire concert hall, just having to like say sorry and like unclip this girl while she kept singing and kept doing, and then she had to like improvise like a dance version of the act without Ariel. So yeah, I certainly wasn't planning to be on stage that quickly.
That's excellent.
I remember Billy Giron's reaction to Maddie falling in the pool was just like, kept riding.
And the whole conversation on comms was, are we okay to let a 4-stroke motorbike sink to the bottom of the pool? Are we going to be able to get it out? Or should we just worry about that when the show's done? Nathan, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. My name's Nathan. I'm currently in Chicago at the moment, off work for a little hiatus. Currently working as the general stage manager for Cirque's Kuza, and showstops. I've got the first, when I was asked to think about the most memorable one, or the one that stood out, the first thing that came to my mind was the first time that I actually called for the show to stop, but not as a show caller, when I was on the deck, and from the B1 ring, which is probably maybe like 8 meters away from the main stage underneath the audience seating through a vomitory, could see a stop signal from a corner of the stage during the aerial act, while all of the guys had come back to the ground. So it was one of the few moments where there was some time of choreography where no one was flying, but something was amiss. And so just jumping straight onto the comms, really, really green as well. It was probably within my first 6 months of being there. So I was like super nervous to actually just really like, call the stop when you see something without any kind of hesitation. So that was the first. And then while calling was, there was a lift stop during the bungee sequence that was not recoverable. But as that was happening, we had 2 guys on bungees at tension who were meant to fly above the sinking pagoda, but the pagoda wasn't at depth for them to fly safely, even though they were already at tension. And also we had 8 Stinger girls in the grid at however high that was, like 20 meters or whatnot, them not being able to be set down because, again, the stage also hadn't sunk. So having to stop a show and kind of let everyone to their places safely with multiple operators and multiple riggers all communicating on multiple channels to completely pause in the middle of chaos, really. Something that's usually so smooth just kind of came to a screeching a halt. They're the two I remember.
That is one of the worst places to stop, honestly, in the show. Like to have to be, it's like so many people in the air, right? It's chaos. My name's Anna. I've been doing a lot of webinars, so hopefully you guys know me already, but I'm the co-founder and managing director of TheatreArtLife. I'm also a freelance production stage manager, producer, and I work around Asia Pacific. So, and also the Middle East recently. So I'm just moving around doing different projects here and there, a bit of show calling, a bit of producing. My favorite showstop, or, you know, I mean, there's so many I can't count. So I don't really have, I only have one that really stands out and that I could probably speak about. And Dean and Rex will probably remember this one. Very early on in the House of Dancing Water history, we had not tamed or mastered the beast. That is the stage. And we had a situation very early on in the first few months of the show where we had a massive oil leak into the pool. And it was somebody's great idea to put the masking bubbles on, the bubbles in the water, to perhaps bring the oil to the surface. But really what happened was it just made salad dressing. It made the whole pool a salad dressing. And I remember standing backstage and all the executives of the show and the producers and everybody in this, like, because I'm kind of short, right? And they were all around me like, Anna, can we do a show? And I'm looking at them like, you want me to do the House of Dancing Water without water? Let me see. And you know, ironically, later on in the evolution of the show, there were versions we did without water, as you guys know. But at that point, we had no idea. I'm like literally looking at my prom script going, yeah, no, I don't think we've got a show, guys. I think we should cancel. And I just, it was just like,
like 2 months. We've been open.
It was an insane moment. I'm like, what are you asking me to do? I don't know what we're supposed to do. And then having said that, it was oil, right? So even the fact that we could have had a stage, the oil that, you know, we moved to another oil later on in the thing, but the first oil was vegetable oil. And so it was on the stage. So even if you wanted to put people on the stage, it was slippery as hell. And I remember Kirk getting on stage trying to do some backflips or something and just slipping all over the place. Like, we can't even do anything dry. Nothing is happening here. We're going to empty the pool and figure this out. So that was pretty chaotic. I sent, for those who registered up until yesterday, a bunch of videos for you guys to watch. So hopefully you've got a little context of the House of Dancing Water. For those who registered in the last 12 hours, I'm sorry, you probably missed that out. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, so bear with me, panel guys, so people can get some context of the show and Macau. And then we'll go back into talking about the details. Now, in our last session, we talked a lot about our stage management team and how we work together. And today we're going to drill down a little bit about how we manage show stops and emergency situations. So please keep the questions coming. A few of you sent some very good questions in pre, and hopefully we'll answer them throughout the session. But let's go through some of our information first, and then any other questions that if we don't cover that, then we'll go through the questions, okay? So let me just go into this one. Okay, so for those who don't know where Macau is, it's that little red dot in the middle of Asia there. Macau is about an hour away from Hong Kong by ferry, and it's on the borders on the edge of China as well. It's about 7 miles long, 7 miles wide, and it's the Asian Las Vegas. Here's a couple of pictures. It's based on it has a Portuguese and Chinese history. So the Portuguese were there for quite some time, gave it back to China a number of years ago. And it's a really thriving economy for China and Asia because of the casinos. A lot more money is spent in Macau than it is in Las Vegas in terms of revenue for gambling. And yeah, it's all shut down right now because of the coronavirus, but funnily enough, the House of Dancing Water is still going. They just reopened. This is the City of Dreams complex, which is where the theatre is. And it's a combination of a number of hotels and a casino floor. And our lovely theatre is at the back of that section. And here is the inside of our theatre. It's kind of like a little inside of a lantern. And that's where we're going to sort of talk about the show stops and the situations that we have. The team, I won't show the trailer because I assume that you guys have seen some of the videos. And for those who didn't see those videos, I can send them in the chat box soon, so you can have to take a look. I've probably got the cameras in the wrong position right now. But this was our stage management structure. Let me see if I can move you guys. And we had a general stage manager, a senior stage manager, we had a lead stage manager, 3 stage managers, and 2 assistant stage managers. The formulation of that stage management team evolved and changed over time. For example, when we began, there was just like me as the general stage manager and all of the other stage managers and assistant stage managers. But because we needed a lot of structure, we needed a lot of support, we needed a lot of procedures, we installed a senior stage manager and a lead stage manager to do different, take on a lot more responsibilities. So the general stage manager didn't have it all on one person's shoulders. So that's basically the structure. I know I'm going really, really quick, but I want to go straight into the show stop stuff so that we can get talking in detail about that. There are a number of ways that we approached emergency management and show stops, and we can show you details of these documents and sort of stuff soon, but we want to really talk first so that you're not lost in all of that information because it's quite complex. So from the top, we have obviously we have our prompt script, which is the main calling script for the show. And then we have what we call alternate prompt scripts. So that was prompt scripts we built to deal with shows that had variants. So if we didn't have the boat in the show, that would be an alternate prompt script. If we didn't have the Russian swing act in the show, that will be an alternate prompt script. So that was something that we just take out, print out, and slip into our main prompt script and call instead of the normal cue script. We also had something that I built called the show call SOP, Standard Operating Procedure. And basically this was a list of everything that could go wrong in every scene and what you would to deal with it. Now, it wasn't something that you would literally call differently, but situations that you might experience. So what could happen that could go wrong in boat? What could happen that would go wrong in this situation? And then basically that was born out of experience of what we would do and how we would handle that situation. And so that was more of a recommendation of, okay, when you experience that, this is what we've done in the past and this is what you should try to do. Keeping in mind that every situation can possibly be different given the circumstances of the show. So it's a guideline. It's not a rule of law of how you must respond to a situation, but it's just a bit of background information. On the artistic side, if you look on the right side, we had the out sheets. So these were basically a summary from scene to scene about what was different in the show. And that was circulated with the stage management team to communicate to the artistic team, make certain artistic choices based on the restrictions that we had. And they would then communicate and manage that information with the cast. The lineup as well, which was a daily explanation of where everybody was in each positions. A lot of that information of changes in the show would be expressed through the lineup. Whenever we had major incidents, be that an emergency or a major show stop, we would always hold a post-show meeting following the major incident with all of the relevant parties. And that was a way of reassessing to see if we did a good job about that, or if we needed to change something, and it was just a self-reflection moment where we would make sure that we are, acting on each and every instance. We would also always address the situation with the cast. If it was major, we would do it straight after the show. If it wasn't major, maybe we'd do it the next day or at the next Tapé Rouge, which was our group meetings. And we'd make sure that people understood maybe what happened in the emergency, how we handled it, what the situation was technically. If there's a lot of technical problems in the show, you know, cast most likely want to be reassured that they're safe, and so they need to understand why and how a situation happens. So a lot of times we would address that with them. On the other side, from a backstage stage management point of view, we had our track sheets that obviously everybody followed, the stage managers. We had 5 backstage tracks that were run, and at the bottom of each track sheet was their emergency responsibilities. So emergency tasks or responsibilities were allocated per track, not per the person. So because people rotate through jobs and through roles and through being on the show and off the show. So we always wanted to allocate the responsibilities of a particular person or a particular track so that was changeable, because we'd always have the track, we might not always have the person, if that makes sense. So the emergency responsibilities of that track were also part of their track, so they knew that when something went wrong, their role when they were doing that track was to do that. We then had emergency standard operating procedures, which is what we were to do when things went wrong. So we'll go through those a little bit. We also had a radio protocol that we shared with the physiotherapy or performer wellness team, who were the key first responders for major incidents. So we would all speak on comms, and we have that protocol, and then we would have a radio protocol where we would communicate to the team backstage in how to deal with the situation. And we would rehearse a lot. We would rehearse monthly scenarios with the entire technical and artistic team, and we would also rehearse as a stage management team. For a while there, weekly, we'd do our radio practice, and we'd come and go and do that. So that was pretty fun. And in the little square that you probably can't see at the bottom there because we're covered by our camera, we also had training standard operating procedures. So that was how we would respond to emergency situations in a training situation. And that was largely could be quite different than how we respond to it in a show. Okay, I'm going to go through one more slide, and then I'm going to stop talking so we can let the other guys talk a little bit. But we'll talk a little bit about those documents and procedures in a second. But what I want to go to is what was our motives, or what was our reasoning or rationale for stopping a show. And so a lot of the factors that we considered when we were considering a show stop situation would be your experience and confidence as a show caller and your ability to handle a situation. And that grows over time as you become a competent show caller in the show, or, as much as you know. And it's not whether you can call shows or not. It's got nothing to do with that. It's your depth and breadth of knowledge of the show that you're actually running. So if you understand where the cast is, if you understand the technical elements that need to be fixed, if you understand those things, you might be able to navigate a path that'd be more efficient than somebody that has less knowledge of that. So safety factors. So what decisions do you need to make to keep everybody safe? That was first and foremost. Artistic versus producer priorities. So what was a reasonable compromise artistically to keep a show going? So as you probably would be aware, we want to put the best show on possibly from an artistic perspective, but also the producers are going to want to make sure that show is delivered from a money aspect. So there can be conflicts there, and how do you navigate through that? Whether it was the first show or second show was a major factor of our show stops, because if you are running a first show and you're eating away a show stop time, you've got another audience coming in an hour and a half after the first show's finished. So whether you finish that first show or not, or if you're going to be sacrificing the second show to try and finish the first show, could be a factor of you continuing or not. The estimated timeline of fix. So, was it something that you were going to be able to get fixed in a certain period of time? And then that obviously that would weigh into your whether you would continue or not. Where we were in the show was also a big factor. You know, if you're right at the start of the show or right at the end of the show, there's a number of factors that you would say, okay, where do we start or do we not, or do we not finish the show because we're this far along, etc., etc. And then the most obvious is the changes that we may needed to continue the show on timeline to roll that out. So perhaps we've lost a lift or we've lost a winch, and is that an easy thing to overcome from an artistic and technical perspective? Can we communicate that effectively? Do we feel confident that that's a safe way to move forward given the changes? Every time that you make modifications to the show on the fly, or you're changing things up, you obviously raise the risk of generally, because people may not know that lifts up or that lifts down, or maybe not been communicated to. So that was where stage management became extremely important, that it was very, very confident. They were very, very confident that everybody understood where we were going, and if we didn't feel confident with that, then we wouldn't pursue a show variation that we were being asked to do. So we could never set hard and fast rules, as these guys know, but we always had a baseline of what we may or may not do in each situation, and then that was the tools that the show callers would use to navigate their way forward and make decisions. So I'm going to shut up for a second. So do any of you guys want to weigh in a little bit on that procedure? Did I miss anything? Because I just kind of put those little notes. Was there any other factors that you feel that you considered in a show stop that I missed there?
I don't think so. I think the majority of it was there. I mean, it's always a hard one because, as you said, it's like it's your baseline, but anything and everything can and did happen.
No. Well, I'm glad I covered that all.
And you said,
for sure. I think for me, the most important kind of tenet of it was the show caller's experience. Obviously, going into any production, no matter how experienced a show caller you are, kind of in a way like offering that show the respect of you not intricately knowing all of its moving parts, including the people that make up those moving parts, kind of sets you at a place where you might be stopping shows in the first 6 months of calling that after 2 years of calling the same show, you wouldn't second guess to stop, because you're much more confident to be able to fix a lot of materials in the midst of still calling cues and still going through stuff. But in saying that, I think that's pretty unique to Dancing Water too, because we had so many cues that were setting up things 10 minutes in advance of something else happening. So we were able to do a lot of stuff to keep the show going in a certain kind of way, even while there was kind of something happening on stage in the moment. And then obviously you had that baseline of, well, if you get to a certain point, then there's no doubt, there's no question, it just has to stop as soon as it can safely.
And I think depending on the experience of the caller is depending when you get to the red light scenario from the orange light scenario. I think a more experienced caller can stay in the orange light a little bit longer because they know the moving parts a little bit better, whereas a new caller might go, okay, this is overwhelming me right now, and that's a considerable safety factor in itself. So it's time to stop, and then you get the red light going.
The only other thing I would say, oh, sorry, Nathan.
No, go ahead.
Is that it also depended on your relationship with the operators as well, especially the operators of automation and who was on those consoles at the time. Because if it was someone who was a newer operator, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to go into those different situations so easily. So there would be a conversation between you and the operator to be like, are you comfortable to move into this version? Do you need some time? And if it was something where they weren't comfortable, then that also impacted your factors as well.
Yeah, I remember when we did I was calling the first anniversary show, and the center stage was not low enough to fly the Dark Queen in. And do you remember, Rex is smiling because I think she remembers this, and I was like, you know, historically, because I've built the show, I was a lot more cowboy than other people. And also I had operators that had also helped build the show. So I had asked the question to Sean. I said, can we still fly the Dark Queen in, but can you just stop her a little bit earlier? And Nathan's like, oh my God, you would never do that. And to be honest, at that time, you know, we told the Dark Queen, she was prepared. Sean was like, yep, I can do it. I'll ramp down the queue. Nobody should do those things on the fly. Like, nobody should do that. But because we had this working relationship where that happened, we able to land her safely, and we were able to continue the show. I also remember another one, which you guys will laugh. I don't know if there was, basically, for everybody who's listening, there was a bridge that used to go down, and it had to get struck before it would come up for the straps act, and it needed to get to plus 10 centimeters before we could start the act. But this is, again, it comes down to the relationship with the cast as well. So we still all had the creation team. So they were used to seeing things that weren't there and not there and things. Like, now you would never do this with the cast, because they would just like fall into the water like lemmings, because they would not be aware of Dean or Rex. But I said, okay, I'm going to start the straps act, but you need to tell the guys to walk over the bunkers to get to the center stage, because the north lift is not going to be there. And it was coming, it just wasn't going to be there. And I knew that I had enough time before I started the act for it to be there, because it has to be there for the straps guys. But again, it was like another cowboy move, because I was like, okay, let's go. And they came out and they walked around the bunkers, around the empty lift, and we started the act. So it often comes down to that experience, and now, even not experience of a show caller, but the cast. And when you start doing a lot of cast changeovers, they don't have the awareness or the knowledge of the beast that they're working on. So you would never take that risk now. You would never do that. So a few of you last time had asked to see the prompt script, and so we'll just show you a little bit of the prompt script so you can see what it looks like, because it's not like anything else. Something that I had built, and it's not the right way or the wrong way, but a lot of the information that we have is based on automation cues and not on a score or a script. So this is basically what an example of the prompt script looked like. Blue was standbys, and black was cues. Yellow was something that would be involved with audio, music, sound. Orange was something that you would have to do yourself, start a stopwatch or press a button or change a camera. Green was clears that you got from a dry rigger or a person backstage, and the blue were clears that you get from the aquatics console, which was the underwater action. The cues on the left are cue points, and on the right was what is moving or what's happening when you call that cue. But generally, when you're calling the show, you shouldn't be looking either at the left or the right, because you know those things innately. You're just focusing on the information in the center. So that's basically how we built the prompt script. Maybe Dean and Nathan can sort of weigh in about what yours look like now for Cirque, and how different or similar they may be. How do they work there?
It's interesting. I had a conversation with a Cirque stage manager yesterday, and we were talking about how different it is across all of the different Cirque shows. And it really depends on who you are handed across from the stage manager before. There's not a Cirque du Soleil way of setting up a prompt copy, basically. So the prompt copy that I was handed for Lucia when I started there, I started 6 months into the tour, was written in Word, and it was basically an essay. It was all text. It was all text based, and it was the stage manager before me, Grant, fantastic stage manager, lovely man, used to be a doctor, and that's the way he processes information, very quickly, all in text. It was very interesting to see, but it's not the way my brain worked, and especially after like 7 years at House, my brain had developed into that prompt script. So I changed my prompt script at Lucia is now pretty much exactly the same as House. Similar colors, similar layout with the technical information in the right-hand column, the cue point in the left, and the cues down the center. So exactly the same layout, and similar color coding. I think I've changed the color coding slightly. where the standbys and the goes, but pretty much it's exactly the same. It works. My brain's used to processing information quickly in that format. And that's what it's down for every stage manager. It's how you look at information. It's how you process information. If it works for you, then it works for you. Some shows like House, I have to say, you have to call from that prompt script. You can't let the stage managers go off and create their own prompt scripts because there's too much information to capture on a day-to-day basis with too much ramification. So if someone misses a cue that's changed in the main prompt script, and we've all got the updated version of that main prompt script printed out, another stage manager has to go off and put that into their format. Well, they may miss something, or they may confuse something, or there's an element there that is just, it's too great a risk to be able to take. So you have to call from.
Not to mention that we probably had about how many, like 15 or so alternate prompt scripts. So that you're not only updating the main one, but you've got to update all of the alternate ones as well, which is just that's kind of like a minefield. What about you, Nathan?
Sure. Yeah, what Dean mentioned there about SMs having different prompt scripts. When I first joined Cirque, that was something that I noticed. Well, the first show I joined was Volta, and that was still maybe a year in to its creation. So that kind of everyone was working off the same script, and it was still kind of like getting polished as some time went on. But with Kuza coming in, and Kuza was already running for 12 or 13 years when I started. So it was very ingrained in a lot of tradition in terms of stage managers having their own prompt scripts and that kind of stuff. The GSMs being kind of like the main one that kind of all the changes start from and then branch out to the others. However, there is the kind of like free ability for stage managers to create their own. So I know that Georgia SM has all of the stage plots added to her prompt script, so she sees more of the moving parts as a visual reference in terms of where the trolleys are placed around the stage. Whereas I'm not too fond of visual references on the prompt script, so I don't have those. So it kind of does allow the stage manager to kind of be able to do something that's kind of more for them. But in a similar way, like we have goes are all in the center, and then on the two sides in long lines, there's a lot of descriptive stuff for Kuza in terms of what's happening on stage, and a lot of stuff crosses so many different musical action and also safety clear times and somewhat simultaneously. So there is a really like the way that the show can be called can be quite synchronous as well. So there's a lot of detail in the prompt script, mostly used for training, because you're not reading that stuff while you're calling a show. But in the training situations, you can really kind of absorb into that and kind of really get into how the show is kind of really meant to run, especially for something that's been running for so long. And I felt that at House, that was very similar. We had a lot of things in the prompt script that were like musical cue. So you would learn as you were studying the show call with Anna or Rex or Dean or Mads. As I was learning the show call, it was kind of like you would learn how people would listen to the show differently, but ultimately create the same image from different perspectives. And that kind of gave you a kind of very loose wiggle room between certain parts that you could react to the action on stage and react to the music. And then branching that into like a showstop situation, that would give you more of a kind of understanding in terms of how long you can let something milk before you have to come to a clean stop a little bit later. So there's kind of variation, but at the same time, like those pinpointing times too.
Milk it so you can keep it going.
Yeah, right.
Try and keep it
What
going.
I'll do is I'll show the an alternate prompt script, and then maybe Rex, you can throw out some of the questions that are coming in, because I know there's a few. So you saw the basis thing, and then I'm just going to show you, this was like an alternate. So at the top of it, it says, this is kind of a bit of a summary. John, Arnie, and Giraffe Artist on deck at the top of the show. And it just gives you the details of how you are supposed to set it up and what's supposed to happen. And then the prompt script was, I mean, again, it's just a way that we dealt with it. It was everything that was not happening would then be grayed out, as you can see. So you'd still kind of find, from a visual point of view, still call similar things at similar timing, but then you would wipe out all the things that you that are not part of that alternate prompt script. So I don't know how that worked for you guys, but for me, from a mental perspective, it's like, okay, here's what I am doing and here's what I'm not doing, and here is the red was stuff that was different from the usual situation, and because I tried to stay as close to the main prompt script as possible, then it was just a little jump to get to the alternate version of the show, and that's the way that we generally dealt with it. How did you guys feel that worked?
Well, I was super attached to my main prompt copy with all the notes that I had in the show, in my full show version. So unlike some people who used to print a whole new version, I used to just print the section I needed that was the change and like switch between or insert it or switch between the two, because I liked my original paper copy too much.
Yeah.
It worked well, and particularly for the ones that were relatively common, like the version that was no Russian swing or no boat. Everyone became super familiar with them. So we did no Russian swing for like 3 months for a while there. So it was practically a permanent thing. I think it worked well. The harder times I found was when it was like a whole show contingency, where it was North 1, 2, 3 at Dry, which was actually pretty much a completely different show in terms of a calling script. So there was a whole start to finish new version. So when we did that for a while, I pretty much marked up that one in the same fashion that I marked up my original one. So.
And we should probably mention that we had one act in the show that basically changed on a daily basis. So our Straps act had a 5-person and a 7-person version of the show, which would alternate like constantly. So that alternate was actually built into the main prompt copy. So
eventually, originally it wasn't.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Well, by the time I was there. So when you were calling, you would look at the lineup to get that information, which we'll show later, and then you would know which version you were calling, and that was already there, and one was highlighted in yellow and one was highlighted in purple, so you knew already which version to call, but that was all within the same version, so you had to make sure very clearly that you were calling the one version, because it wasn't something that you could slot in and out.
Yeah.
Didn't we have like a little yellow and purple?
Yeah, there was a color code.
On the prompt that was like 7 or 5 that you could set up right at the top of the show.
Yeah, I think it was you, Dean.
Yeah, I think so.
You did that.
I need color coding, otherwise I get.
I'm with you, Dean. Give me the colours.
Give me the colours.
Let me sort my mind.
Purple day or a yellow day? I just need to know that. It's those days where you've got multiple things going on, and you've got like 5. Because I did the same as Rex. I'd insert a page into my main prompt script rather than print out a new one each call, or because I was fond of mine and it had all my little markings on and scribble, and even it means nothing, but it's a visual reference, and you just get comfortable with it calling a show of that magnitude, I think. But it's when you have 7 or 8 different versions inserted into your prompt script, and the prompt script was only 23 pages long, 24 pages long. So you've got like every third page, there's 3 more pages inserted with a staple, and just trying to turn the pages and make sure you don't drop the outsheet on the floor. And then, drop the whole,
And then having to fold your pages so you knew which part to come back to into your main prompt script.
Arrow going, come back in, out. You put an arrow going out here and then into the outsheet here, pick up here, out of the outsheet here, and then pick up back into the main script here.
You make it sound like it's chaos.
Posty arrows.
I think it's the only way it could have worked. Like that show was so complicated, and like if I think of the Kuza script, when we have a soloist go in to like cover a backup act, or when we have a couple little changes because of technical issues or whatever, doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's kind of like that whole sheet is replaced with the new one, but the technical details on that sheet are kind of so easy to edit and change because we really don't have as many moving parts, right? Like one center winch, for example. And it's kind of like going through show stops at house where you kind of would want to turn around a show stop in like 5 to 10 minutes, like something that was semi-regular, like the North Cage in Straps or something like that. Something you knew you could turn around in around maybe 5 to 8 minutes or something. Or I think Mads, you got it down to like 3.5 minutes one time for like, there's like turnaround of a North Cage situation. It's like amazing. But those technical details on the side to know kind of like where things are at depth so you can reference where you are in the show. Because if you're stopping somewhere in Journey, for example, like all of those lifts are doing like a dance of like 20 minutes meters underwater into different positions. And so it's kind of like, how do we come back to what we know, especially with auto follows and that kind of stuff? It gets to be really, really complicated with that system. So you need the info, right?
Yeah, and the good thing with the out sheets though, as well, was that they were designed so that it was kind of, as soon as you started to need that information to start changing, that's when you had it. But also they were kind of designed in a way that the change point was at a good point. Like you weren't swapping back like in the midst of an aerial sequence at the end. You were waiting until like a small downtime, and then so the out sheets would go up to a point that would be a convenient point to then swap back to your prompt copy.
Yeah.
But also
So sometimes it was more than you need.
But also up to a point where you knew technical had completed that sequence, because one of the hardest things with House of Dancing Water is, you know, for example, the bungee act sequence starts like 2 minutes into the swan dance, which is not actually the swan dance, but that's what we called it. Started in swans. So swans is like a 6-minute sequence or something. And the prep for bungee started 2 minutes into that. So if you're making any changes to the bungee act, you had to start before that. The prompt copy switch had to start before that, and then had to continue all the way until when automation had completed unloading people, which is, you know, pretty much running straight into straps. So it's finding that balance, and that's also an important thing when you are thinking about changing the show is, you know, you might want to change this little thing in straps, but it actually could mean, you know, you need to really tech and rehearse a 25-minute sequence of the show to make sure that you cover the start and the end of a loading procedure.
That's true. Before we go into showing outsheets, Rex, is there any questions you think we should answer that are relevant to what the thread that we are on?
We have a lot of questions, which is really great. I've been, just so everybody who's listening understands, I'm monitoring the chat box so that I can answer questions and let you know if we are going to cover that as a group or answer any small questions on the fly. Who wants to show the show stop signal from the artist or crew? Any of you guys? So Lynn, I think you asked. This is the signal that the artists could give at any time to say we need to stop, and it was a case of stopping with no questions asked. You know, we're not going to question, oh, do they really need to stop? We would just automatically ramp the show down to a stop and then work out from them what the issue was. Sometimes it was, it took the artists a long time to feel comfortable that they could do that. I think Dean, Anna.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big call.
There's a few times on boat where people would be like, oh, I should have stopped. And it's like, well, you can.
It's a bit intimidating to throw your arms up in front of 2,000 people and stop an entire machine from moving.
Yeah,
and people feel confident enough to do that was, you know, but, you know, we kept reiterating, we don't care if it turns out to be nothing. If you have that fear, do it, you know, and we'll stop and we'll see what the situation is, and then we'll go back in it. You will never get retribution because you made a mistake, and so hopefully, you know, after a time people felt more comfortable. I mean, some were never going to do it. Some of them were too shy to ever do something like that. But the good thing is, if one person did it, the whole procedure was that everybody else would join in and do it, because the thing is, one show caller looking at everything like that, and stage managers around the building, but one may take a while to notice. So as one person did it, the other person to do it, the other person, and then you've got 10 people on stage doing it, and it's going to be seen really quickly, you know.
Yeah. I've gone back down to the bottom of the question list. We'll answer a couple of those before we keep going. Scott had a question: is it better to show stop or cancel while technical get their heads together? I think that's I'll hand that to you to answer, Anna, or somebody else.
Generally, we always work together in terms of making the required adjustments. So basically, once we'd ramped a show down to a stop, we would talk to the relevant department that had an issue and say, okay, what's going on? And they'd say, okay, give me a few minutes. And then they would figure out what the issue was, and then they would say, okay, is it going to be a 10-minute stop or a 20-minute stop or whatever? And then we would work with the artistic team to base our decisions based on the information that we were receiving. Sometimes that was they have no idea. So we'd go, okay, well, they've got no idea. if and when we start, we're going to start with this point. If we can't start, let's call the director on duty. So the director on duty would come to the booth and they would communicate to the senior management, because if we were going to cancel a show, they would have to be the one to call it, because we as show callers can't cancel the show. So we would just work together and wait to do that. Now, there was always lots of controversy, and everybody would have this, how long are we technically supposed to or allowed to stop? One of the factors is obviously is it first show or second show, and if the second show is, we try and get it back up and running as much as possible. The first show we may set that timeline. My personal sort of thing was, if you don't know how to fix it within 20 minutes of stopping, you're in trouble. And if you're not gearing up to start the show again at 30 minutes after a stop, you're really in trouble. And so really kind of my personal thing was like, okay, they've got 20 minutes to figure it out. They've got 10 minutes to tell me that they're getting it fixed, and I want to be starting within a 30-minute time frame. Now, obviously, so there were days that was pushed to 40 minutes, and there was days that was pushed to even 50 minutes in some dire circumstances. It was a really important show that we wanted to continue and things like that. But my own personal guideline was around that time, because as you can see, the audience gets very, very restless after about 10, 15 minutes. Did we try to put people, like we tried to put some characters in the audience sometime to entertain?
Yeah, we had Anna Arroyo went out there for a while, and I think maybe Yesko and the Dark Queen and the Jean characters went out there, and the Gennady went out into the audience for a while.
But that came really complex, because sometimes the stage would be unsafe, so we couldn't send people out there, you know. And then if they didn't have in-ears, we couldn't get them back. So they'd be out there having a great old time, or like you know.
that was the hardest thing, is getting them back from the audience.
We're ready to go, guys. Get off stage, damn. So that became a little bit too hard to manage. You know, when you're trying to deal with the massive technical problems, you know, managing cast careening around the audience was something that we didn't end up doing for a long time. I don't think so. What else, Rex?
How differently do you handle show stops when you don't have a front of house curtain? And I did put a quick answer to that, saying, we loved it when, if there was a problem that was happening upstage, like particularly when it came to moto accidents, where you'd want to be able to bring the backdrop in to seal off that. And because also people love filming things, and it was our biggest desire to make sure that, you know, an emergency response to a moto accident wasn't being filmed and then put all over YouTube and Facebook and stuff. So not having a house curtain was challenging. We had a great band who used to joke that we should make a CD called the Showstop Greatest Hits, because the band used to just play for as soon as you stopped the show, when you'd run the announcements and the cast had cleared, the band took over and just played, and they would vamp their way through however long, constantly with Mario going, how much longer, Rex? And you'd be like, I don't know, another 5 minutes. And he's like, okay, and off they'd go. Like, and the really cool thing about that is mostly they would play it in the style and the feel of the scene that we'd stopped in. So if you'd stopped going into moto, they had this massive, you know, rock out moto riff that just went for forever. But it is hard, because also to restarting the show, it's difficult to start with someone on stage. Or it's sort of uncomfortable to start with someone on stage, because you have to send them out, sometimes not necessarily with music, because you're trying to ramp up to restart in the right place musically. It is challenging, and also very aware that people just film everything. So I don't know if anyone else has got anything to add to that one.
No, it's the same on the circ shows. You just got to stop. Whether you've got a front curtain or not, you've just got to stop. And if you can somehow try and protect the audience from seeing, you know, an emergency response happening on stage, then you do it as best you can. But, you know, obviously with an emergency response, you still need to give the emergency response light on stage, so you can't plunge them into a blackout so the audience can't see. You know, often if we had a bad accident at a circ show particularly, you know, we might go to an early interval, say. So we'd try and we'd clear the audience out, you know.
Well, we had the screen. We had the screen.
Yeah, we had screens.
That we could bring out if we needed to. And I mean, the other good thing for us is that, like, our show was a water show, right? So a lot of the incidents that were happening was them actually, like, bad landings in the pool, and then part of their process was then getting them to a vom, and by that very nature got them out of the way. Like, it was mostly if something happened in a dry situation, or if they were on straps or attached to some sort of winch, that it was a bit more complicated.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Any more, Rex?
Yeah, there's a few more. I'll just get a couple from the very bottom of the list. So we may cover it. What kind of training were you able to develop to train new show callers on show stops, problems, and contingencies?
Okay, so in very, very short, the way that I used to train callers was that we do a combination of them sitting behind the show caller and watching for maybe a couple of months, right, and following along. Then they would also start to call to DVD for me to make sure that they understood the cues and everything like that. And then there's none of this this is the main call, that had nothing to do with emergencies. And then they would call from the booth seats, which is next to special effects, so they could hear, so I could hear the actual call. So it was like calling in real time. So they're looking at it and they're calling it. They're not actually calling it because the real caller's calling it, but they're practicing over to the left there. And then we would, obviously they do a lot of the stage training, so they know how to call the straps and the bungees and stuff from a practical sense. Often we would get them to do those two most complex sequences in show conditions in a training situation prior to doing it in the real show. And basically that timeline is depending on the individual themselves. Some people who've been in the show for a while as a stage manager had all of that background work, so that process was quite quick. For those who had a lesser depth and breadth of understanding of the show, that process could be, it could take some time. Generally, the average show calling training time is about 3 months, on the premise that you have been in the show at least 9 months and you have groundwork and understanding. And then you go into the show with me behind you, and the whole process is that they call the show. If anything goes wrong in those first few weeks, they step back, and I step in. I don't pick them up like Dean had his experience. but
if anyone could do it, Anna, you could do it.
Bring it, get out of the way. And so I don't want them to stress about having to deal with the problems, because it's stressful enough to try and get the actual call under your belt, let alone deal with problems. So we relinquish that issue by saying, the minute that something goes wrong, I'm in, you're out, and I'll deal with it. And then we do that. About 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the progress of that caller, after calling those shows, the core shows, I would then go through with them the show call SOP and about all the things that would go wrong. And then the callers would enter what I call the fear phase, because they've suddenly realized everything that can go wrong. So they're scared shitless for a few weeks. And so I'm there behind them for that as they now start to think about the minefield of all the things that could go wrong. And over that period, then as little things happen, I'll either let them deal with it, or if they're more major, I may step in. And so it's a kind of a general weaning process during that thing until I move far back, and then one day I'm just not there anymore and you're on your own. So it just depends. Everybody has an individual path, and I hope never. It's kind of disconcerting, and a lot of stage managers are like, I don't want somebody sitting over my shoulder. But then when they realize that it's not there to judge you as a show caller, it's there to support you as a show caller, and that I'm not going to ever judge you on your timing or your queuing or anything like that. I'm here to save your ass if we're in trouble, because we don't want anyone to get hurt. And then somebody, but then they'll be off and fly. Now, having said that, whenever there was a show stop, I would always come to the booth anyway, because a lot of the time people arrive in the booth to try and manage the situation, and it can be very distracting for the show caller. So I used to be like a little barrier between the show caller and whoever turned up in the booth to figure out what was going on, to manage the people there and deal with the director on duty and do all of those things, so the show caller could focus on the situation at hand. And if there was anything that they weren't confident in, we could discuss how they thought they might want to restart the show. And then I'd be like, don't forget the cage. Don't forget that person underwater. Don't forget just a few little, because it's really hard to wrap your head around everything when in a show stop. And even me, like when somebody goes, a stage manager backstage will remind me, hey, I've got this person here. And you're like, oh shit, I forgot about that person. So we always worked as a team to be like, make sure we covered each other's asses and make sure we didn't miss anything as we restart a show.
And when we did our trainings, like our emergency trainings, we would switch like positions. So there are a good chance, especially for like new callers, you're like, okay, well, we're going to do this scenario. So you'll be the caller in this scenario. So you can have a practice of like what you would need to do and how you would communicate this process as well, both when we did our full ones and when we did our small stage management based ones. We would all switch into our different roles to try and give people as much experience as you possibly can before doing it with real audience and real everything, you know.
Anything else, Rex, or should we
move on, I reckon, for the moment?
We're going to do a scenario for you guys soon, if we can all remember, so it's going to be funny. But let me get to a couple more outsheets before these guys I told them to study for it, but I think we're all going to screw it up, but we'll see. Outsheets. So this was one of the outsheets. This was with one lift locked at dry. And that was an artist movement contingency. So you can see basically we've got the acts that we had, and then we had the notes for what happened in each scene that was different or a variation. So this was like a little bit of a cheat sheet that we used for communicating to the cast, and also to put on our lineup, and also as a double check too that our prompt script was on point with that. So that's an out sheet, and that's another one. This is this is also the show call, what I call the show call SOP. So you can see in the boat scene, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about eight sort of scenarios that possibly could happen. The boat cut from show, so we have the no boat contingency. The masts don't reach pressure, we have to stop in that situation. The boat master late to pressure, what you do for that. If the pendulum comes free of the boat, what you do for that. If the dive post can't get struck, what you do for that. If there's an artist accident, boat stuck on stage, etc., etc. So basically, these are the things that have happened, could happen, or may happen. And here's how we. This is just a short list of how we deal with it. Over on the right there is like the actual formal, maybe rescue scenarios or alternate show calls that you're there. Obviously, in a show, you can't refer to that. And even in a show, you can't refer to this show call SOP. You just have to know this information and be prepared for that. So that's something you start to learn after you've learnt the main prompt script, and you start to know, okay, these are the possible things that could go wrong, and here's how I'm going to deal with it. Again, like I said before, this is a guideline and not a hard and fast rule, because any of those situations can be abnormal in this kind of show. So you have to make your best judgment at the time on what course of action you're going to take. What else have we got? Okay, just another one that I'll show you. This is the bottom end of a track sheet. So you can see here, there's the end of the track sheet, and at the end it's got if an artist goes out, what you're supposed to do in a show stop, what you're supposed to do in a motor accident, what you're supposed to do in a fire situation, what you're supposed to do. So all of those come along with some standard operating procedures that each track person needs to learn and understand. And, you know, if you're new to it, you've got those printed out next to you and you're still learning them as you're going along and doing the track. And obviously people who've been here for a long time would support that role. Sometimes in some situations when, say, somebody was learning the B1 North track and they weren't confident, in an emergency situation, somebody who was more confident might swap roles just so that it can be managed more effectively. Like, there's got to be no ego in this situation when it comes to an emergency situation. If you don't feel like you can take charge, or you don't have that depth and breadth of knowledge, then pass it over and no one's going to judge you for it. That's basically kind of like, you know, how we wanted to operate, because it was all of our asses on the line at the end of the day. So we had to put our best foot forward. Rex, got any questions on the back of those couple of docs? You're on mute, I think.
I didn't want to everyone hear me typing, that's all. The emergency tone referred to on the sheet as something that was played in the house or in-ear monitors, or over comms, all of the above.
Emergency tone was something that was used for boat and Russian swing, and this was an act that we could not physically stop by stopping automation or on our own accord. It was an act. These two acts were mainly performer controlled. They did the act, we set it up, and they ran it. Some of the things the reason that we introduced, you'd say, well, why don't we just turn the music off? And that would be an indication that there was a problem. What we had discussed with the coaches and the performers, that abruptly stopping the music, and I'm sure you have the same thing with Mads and Dean and Cirque and Larev and all of that. Stopping musically abruptly in the middle of a trick could be such a shock that you could compound the issue by doing so. So say for somebody, if we're like pushing on the Russian swing, they've just called up and they're about to fly and suddenly the music cuts out completely, that's going to freak them out, and you could have a bigger problem on your hands. So what we decided was we would add to the music. It's something that we used at Cirque when I worked in Vegas. We would add music on the top to let everybody know that there was a significant sound that if they heard it, it meant slow down and stop, as opposed to keep going or whatever. And then they would just be able to look around them and start to figure out what's wrong. Is somebody hurt? Is somebody injured? And so that's why we use the emergency tone in those situations. We'd also have the lights. If you've been in the other sessions, we talked about, we had a red light, orange light, and green light up in the booth. And if we had a problem, we would turn that red light on. So it was kind of twofold. The emergency tone would come, they would look up at the booth, they'd see the red light, and they're like, the show, they're asking us to leave the stage. So we slow down our routines and we get off, and then we'll get more information once we get backstage.
And we had those in the VOMs too. Sorry, we had in the VOMs as well, the red and green light. So if you weren't in a position where you could physically see the booth because you were facing the other direction, then you could also look into the VOMs as well to see those lights too.
Mm-hmm. There's been a couple of questions about how much time prior to opening did you have to prepare for potential stops?
Yeah, none.
Well, with the exception of moto, I mean, we did have a whole procedure in place for moto from the very beginning, but everything else, it was stop and work out what's next.
Yeah, we wanted to know we could signboard a moto guy, because obviously you put a FMX act in your show, there's a high chance that's a possibility. But we have no, these procedures is what we built over the first year, 2 years, and then fine-tuned them over the next 5 or 6, and there's probably still going in terms of fine-tuning and adjusting. That you can never stop work on these things, because the show itself is an evolving beast. But no, you don't have that, and that's what's so rock and roll in the first year or two of running the show. You're finding out the problems that are happening for the first time. You're figuring out how to overcome them. You're working together. Fortunately, the creation team, which isn't necessarily the case on other shows, but fortunately, the creation stage management team were the same people who are running the show. So the fact that I built the cues and then had to adjust them is an easier transition than somebody taking over those cues from somebody that doesn't have an innate understanding of how those things were constructed. So that was an advantage, I think, to us, especially because we created a very, very complex show. And everybody, and that I always used to say to show callers, like all the ones here, were actually better at sometimes making decisions than me, because I'd never managed the cast backstage. So these people had managed all the cast backstage. They'd come up into the booth, they'd have an issue, and they'd know innately where all of the people were and how fast they could get them to the right places to start again. I never had that knowledge, because I never had that innate backstage depth of understanding. And even to this day, when I left, I mean, I could only do one track. I sucked backstage. So, and even then I was bad at B1 North if there had to be lineup changes. So I was like pretty, I could only I could call the show, or I could lay towels. That was about all I could do.
What else? From Alison, if the show was stopped, was there always a protocol of where to pick it back up, or how did you decide and communicate that with everyone, where the show would start back up from?
Who wants to answer that one? I'll let you guys speak.
It was pretty organic from memory. I mean, there's only, with a show that technical, there's only so many solutions to a problem, really. And there's only so many places you can pick up from depending on where you are. And if you don't want like a 15-minute reset in order to get back up and running again, you kind of go, okay, this is where the lifts are at, this is where the winches are at, this is where the riggers are at with their presets. Where does it make sense to pick up from? Where's the quickest place we can pick up from here? Obviously, if a stop happens right at the start of an act, ideally you go back and start that act again But that's not always the case. Sometimes it was just way too, sometimes it would take us, God, if we stopped in the first few seconds of Pagoda, it might take us 15, 20 minutes to get it preset again to run that act again. So we generally just jump to the end of that act and then move on from there. So it depends on where you can pick up from, really.
And also with what people are familiar with, because there's a bunch of, there was several places that people were quite familiar with a potential stop, and everyone's like, okay, we know what we do here. We modify this choreography, we enter here, and then we just continue on as normal. But then there's other ones that you're like, oh, this is different. We've never done this before. What works best for technical, but also what works best artistically? Because that's why as a show caller, if we had the ability to push through and work around a problem until a logical stop in the show, that was a better place for people to then get their heads together to pick up again from. Because it's like ramping down this massive machine to a stop and then having to like kickstart it again and get it restarted.
And then artistic would be involved in that as well, because, I know that Johnny, particularly as artistic coordinator, and Ksenia as dance captain when I was there, they would come and they would know the out sheets as well. So they would know, depending on where we'd stopped, there was a lot of, they happened common enough that there was a clear pickup point that we would go to. So then they would help then with communicating with the artists as well as to how that would happen artistically in terms of choreo that needed to change, or, that, and they would communicate with us and the artists as well in those instances.
For sure. So I wanted to add to that as well, like a habit that I picked up very quickly after starting to call was, as soon as it was possible, like once the stop was established and all the communication that you were involved with kind of came to an end, straight away going to the band, being like, where are we at? What's the earliest point you can go back to? What's the earliest point you can jump to? Can you pick up from exactly where you were? Like, and having those free time references kind of sometimes will just completely overshadow an artistic preference, because it's just not possible based on where the band can pick up from their sequences, especially how the band leader was also the drummer and running like a lot of the loops as well. So they're kind of, in terms of their own choreography, what they were physically able to accomplish as well might not have resonated with kind of what an artistic preference may have been. So it was kind of that for me, that ended up taking like the first seat, like what's possible, and then pitching that to, or using that to kind of guide the captains to make those artistic decisions. Or if we had an AD present in the booth to help out with those things, then kind of going down that route as well, if that was the case. But again, organic.
But also,
and there was some.
Sorry, go.
There was some practical restrictions as well. Like, you get halfway through the straps act, like you'd never go back and start the straps act again unless you wanted 7 straps artists at your door after they're yelling at you for making them do it twice, right? So, like, there's certain things you're like, okay, that would be silly to go back again, because it just doesn't make sense physically for the performers to have to do that act twice. You'd never go back and do Russian swing twice and things like that. So there's just some logical, that when you know the show and you understand the show, that those are things are not even options. And then there's the practical and artistic aspects as well. What were you going to say, Rex? I
was just going to say, and the practical aspect goes back to when we were talking about the timing of show stops. Like, if you're talking about it being a 30-40 minute show stop, you're dealing with 90 artists who are now getting cold, and so they're getting out of there. So always being aware of how long the show stop is and what's next in terms of an acrobatic act, or even in terms of the moto act. Like, if you're going to jump closer to moto, have you given the moto artists enough time to warm their bikes up? And just being aware of that time frame. And just relating to show stops in general, I discovered quite early on that how we spoke about the show and how technical spoke about the show, we shared a very common language, but then sounds language in terms of what they called things was a little bit different. So sometimes I'd say, okay, Mario, we're going to go from here. And he'd be like, great. And then we'd go to start and I'm like, no, that's
not it.
Not there. Like 30 seconds before that. And he'd be like, but you told me, the start of Swans. But for them, their language of how they talked about the show within the sound team and within the band was slightly different. So we sat down and brought that language back together to make sure that, because over time, that's what just developed because there was thousands and thousands of different cues within the band setup and within the sound system and how they had programmed the show. So they all had they had to break it down a bit more than we had. So we had to be very, very clear with what we were talking about when we said start of swans. We literally meant when the fountain started. We didn't mean the 30 seconds prior to that. So yeah, it was interesting sort of bringing that language back together.
And speaking on musicals briefly, like that is the joy of musicals, is because generally you're calling to a score. And so when the very first person you're going to talk to about your restart is generally the musical director, because you need to talk about like where musically you can pick up from, like especially if your show has a lot of I can't think of the word right now, but like if you're using like you're triggering things, yeah, and click, like if you're playing off click, they need to start the click at certain points. But then also it's easy because then you can specifically say like, I want to start from bar 23, and you and the musical director know exactly what that is, you know, because you're calling from that score. Yeah,
my idea of heaven.
Exactly. So I mean, the harder thing for me more recently is communicating that to 9 to 12-year-olds is where you're going to pick up from, especially if it's musically and it's mid-song. Like, you know, it's very important that you're all on the same page in terms of language, and that was something we discovered really quickly on School of Rock as well, because what the songs were called in the score was not what the creative team called them when they taught them to the kids. So we very quickly had to adapt that language as well, like, and also having often, you know, in a musical, you'll have many versions of the same song that's repeated throughout. So to be particular of like, oh, we're going to pick it up from this song, you know, at this point as well. So you've got to, it's that communication language of what your show breakdown is super important.
Cool. So Rex, anything else before we pretend that we're in a moto incident?
We've got heaps of questions. Just probably a simple one to answer. A good question, which I hadn't actually considered for a long time, is how did we deal with color coding and potentially a caller who's colorblind, or anyone who's colorblind?
We didn't have that situation from memory, but you know, there's always a way to go around it. I feel like if there was, you know, obviously people see shades of greys or colors like that, but maybe we could have put a shape or something next to the cue that would have indicated that, you know, a square, a circle or whatever, as long as there's some kind of visual reference that we could add to the prompt script to give people the understanding of what the differences between text and things are. So I would probably then go to shapes, something like that. What about you guys?
We actually just dealt with this on School of Rock because most of our furniture was brought on stage by the kids. So every scene had a different spike color. So they would learn that scene had that color, and then they would know which place to put their desk or their chair. But then we actually found out that we had a lot of, I think we had 3 kids who were colorblind. So, and unfortunately it's one of those things that, especially as like a 7 or 8-year-old, you don't necessarily want to admit. So they could never get their piece of furniture to where they needed it to go.
Oh, no.
We couldn't work out why. Like, we just constantly like, but the spike's right there. Like, and then we realized it was because they were colorblind, and so they were mixing up the colors, because we had like something like 10 or 12 colors. So some of them were so close in variation for them that they couldn't tell. So we actually managed that by writing on the writing little letter abbreviations on the spike marks as well. So then they looked for the letters. They knew based on the numbering system on the front of the stage approximately where they were looking for, and then they could see the letters to actually line it up as well. So we used lettering in that instance, but I think shapes would work just as easily as well.
Or there might be a different, prompt script, you don't need a few different colors. You don't need 4 or 5, 6 different colors. So maybe there's 4 or 5, 6 different colors that are easily for a colorblind person to differentiate between, because it's only a few different colors that they can't see.
Yeah, 1 black, 1 white, 1. Oh God, no, it's a challenge, but there's always a way around it, right? All right, so let's go talk through a moto scenario of what each others would do. Now, we're not going to like actually be like me calling or whatever, but let's just talk. So I think I said I will be calling. Who'd I put B1 North? Rex. And
really
Dean on level 4.
Yeah.
And Mads, you're in lift, right?
Oh no, I'm on roller.
Roller. and Nathan was the
I'm
other.
2SMs. I'm ring and lift.
Lift, yeah. So we had 5 backstage tracks, and basically, we'll show you the paperwork after it. But here's the situation in a motorbike accident, okay? And what I'll just say from step 1, what I would do, and maybe what the B1 North person would do. Now, there's 2 ways that a motorbike accident would happen. I would see it, or the B1 North person would probably see it, or the level 4 North person would see it. Now, from a show calling perspective, and then I'll let Rex explain from a B1 North perspective. What I did when we were training the show caller for the moto act is we would never want to say stop, because if somebody's hitting that ramp at like the speed that they need to hit that ramp and you say stop, you're going to freak them out and cause another accident. So the verbal training that I did and the other guys did was we had to say write it down, and we repeat that, because just so everybody knows, the motorbike riders have in-ears in, and they hear and they run the act by the show calling from our voice. So they're hearing us all the time. So you have to be very careful about what you're saying on comms, that you're not shouting, that you don't say anything abruptly, that everything, because they're jumping 20 meters in the air, and you need to keep them safe. So what I used to do, even to the last day when I was calling the act, I would call the cue, and in my head I'd be like, write it down, to train my brain to say that as a response when it actually happened. Because if you don't train yourself to say the right thing, you're going to probably say the wrong thing. So I would always say write it down. So if it did happen, all I'd have to do is just open my mouth and write it down would come out. Okay, so write it down would be the first thing that would come out of our mouth if we saw an accident. And my job as the show caller was to work with the B1 North person, and we both have a cue light, which is backstage, that has red lights around all the entrances, and this is particularly for the motor guys. And we are to press that button. Now, for me, usually that was, Rex will probably explain, usually that was the B1 North person, because the show caller actually had to turn away to press that button. And it is not your reaction to turn away when you've just seen a motorbike accident, right? So usually the person up north would be pressing that button. What that did is to stop the riders. Everybody else to stop, because obviously we want to stop, and we can't go and help that person until we know everybody else has stopped, okay? So my job as a show caller is to say, write it down. Double check that red light is on, because usually the B1 North person's to say it. And then I'm to check that the riders have stopped, because I've got cameras all the way backstage. And then I'm going to give a clear to respond. So that's really the first step for me, is that simple. And Rex?
Okay, so when you're in B1 North during the show for the moto act, you're standing upstage. Upstage in the west. Oh my God, I cannot remember anymore. You're standing. It's B1 North is northwest. So essentially, it's just you're standing just out of the audience sightline in the northwest. You're standing with a physio. It's part of that act that the act does not start unless there is a physio in B1 North. There is also a physio in the B1 physio room, which is 10 meters away on the B1 ring. So you've got 2 physios present downstairs. They jump east to west and west to east and north to south. And the majority of the accidents we had were in the north. So if I, as the B1 North person, saw a rider go down, the show caller is probably going to see it as well and be saying write it down already. But I would say on show call, write it down, and be hitting the red cue lights that flash all the lights around the VOMs for the remainder of the riders. Physio. Catherine.
Is it physiotherapist?
Physiotherapist, performer wellness, who assist with emergency responses. I'd hit the red cue lights, and I would be waiting to hear for a clear from Anna to attend to the rider in B1 North. Mostly when there was an accident in coming off the north ramp, they skidded right up into the very north area, which gave us the grace of being able to bring the backdrop in front of them, which was a really wonderful thing. I would be waiting for a clear from Anna to be able to give a clear to the physio and the carpentry team to go to attend the rider. Being aware that there's the potential of fire, there's the potential of a petrol spill, a fuel spill from the bike. So keeping that in mind at the same time, we give the clear to physio and the carpenters to start attending to that person and go straight out. And the B1 North person becomes the second responder with the head of physio, well, the physio who was with you at the time. You also give a clear to the show caller to bring the backdrop in if the backdrop is actually clear. You try and feed information and then it's a case of feeding information, knowing who the rider is. The riders all wore different coloured, it sounds really silly, and I really pushed against it to start off with because I just could not remember these colours for I don't know what reason, but they all had a different coloured handkerchief, which as they jumped, you could see it fly out the back of their costume. And it was really important that was visible because I knew that green was Victor, or, that red actually wasn't red. Pink, the blue one was Javi. Like I knew which aren't the colours, but I knew which rider it was based on before I even got to them, if I could see what colour their costume was. So, and pretty much from then the B1 North person is with physio until the point that we can hand over to someone else and start working back towards a show restart. But in terms of physio, in terms of a motor accident, it was quite often a decent period of time.
So meanwhile, the level 4 person who's generally spotting from the level 4 catwalk, looking down on it. So you can always also be the person to say write it down as well, right, Dean? So then what do you do?
Well, I mean, basically you're watching the whole act from above. So you've got a really good overview of the entire stage from level 4. You're basically 4 stories above the stage. So you can see all of B1 North, you can see anyone jumping, and you can see we were on the east side watching the act. So you could see, even when they went through the west vom, you could see right out into the back of the vom, and then you could see them go about halfway down the east vom. So I think you guys will all agree, like, we got so used to the sound of a motorbike going up a ramp. It has a real sweet spot on the engine. It makes a specific noise when it's going to make the jump. And when it doesn't make that noise, it doesn't go, rah. If it goes, rah, you know it's going to crash. So you could call a code. You could call a code before the bike's even landed. You know something's about to happen. So the B1 North, the level 4 person could call rider down on show comms as well if they saw it before the B1 North person. Generally, B1 North would only see it if they could see it on the monitor, or if it happened once it actually got into the B1 North area, into the garage area. So then you would call, because level 4 is completely removed from the first aid response. Obviously, we're 4 stories above. We can't get down there in any kind of reasonable time frame to be of any kind of relevant assistance. So we would then be the radio communicator. So as soon as that rider down was called, we'd get on the radio and then call into physio. So to be an emergency code red, rider down, and then the location of where that rider was. So if they were in the B1 North garage, if they were on the ring, if they were on stage, and then it'd be a wait for the show caller to give the clear to respond, and then you would give the clear to respond back on radio to the physio department. When physio is the physiotherapy, someone asked what physio is. It's the performer wellness or physiotherapy, or all different titles at different times at house and on different shows around the world. But basically, the performer medicine team.
Yeah. All right.
And that's call on radio specifically for the physio in the B1 ring office, and also for any other physios around the building, because because then they knew that they could also enter the space to help if needs be. The physio that's in B1 North with the B1 North person goes with that B1 North person originally. Yeah.
Okay. Then Mads, because you're in roller.
So I'm on roller. So I'm actually standing in just on the west side of the South Vom, because as well as us cueing the act with in-ears, we also cued the act with physical stage managers as well. So there were 3 stage managers on the ring. The roller person is in the South Vom. So as soon as the rider down is called and the emergency signal is pressed, then our job is to physically enforce that as well by doing a big stop signal to all the riders on the ring, just in case they haven't heard it on in-ears or they haven't seen the red light. So our job is to make sure that we're physically enforcing that, and then also to make sure that they actually stop. And then once they have stopped and the clear to respond is said on comms, then my job as roller was to mainly firstly deal with the rest of the bikes and the rest of the riders. So because often, you know, if there's just one person in the ring, you have all these bikes that are then like littered around the ring as well. So I would deal with the riders and then making sure that they stored their bikes correctly. So there were around the ring, we had like little bike racks. So they would go make sure they went and parked their bike rack so that they were then out of the way. Because generally when we were going to pick up again, we wouldn't be picking up with the moto act. So we wanted to make sure all those bikes were out of the way. And they got stored in an outside room generally. But during that stage, we didn't want to take them out. So we just make sure they're stored. And then I would be standing by for a response from of assistance from B1 North, because my job is to primarily deal with the bikes first. Then I'm not one of the first responders that gets there. So then I would be waiting to hear where I would be necessary. It might be immediately, if we thought it wasn't going to be too long, it might be immediately dealing with the restart or dealing with other artists, or keeping artists away from a situation rather than actually physically dealing with the accident myself.
Mm-hmm. And Nathan?
Nice. So I think there was a little question there about the terminology for track names, and just to respond to that, I'm not sure who it was, but yeah, we're talking about show specific track names, I guess, kind of slang that was developed with the show. So obviously level 4 was level 4 because it was on the level 4 catwalk around 17 meters above the stage. B1 North was called B1 North because there was a computer station and camera setup with also a lift visibility numbers on there that would show you that information. So they were stationed at B1 North. They were the lead on show on deck. And then Roller was called Roller because they were primarily in charge of the bikes, as Madison described, but they would take the bikes out to the roller room, which was basically a set of rollers on fixed parking lots for the bikes so that the bikes could actually warm up the wheels without actually driving anywhere. And they're called rollers. That extended to the track name. Then we had the two other ones, which I'm kind of pretending to be Ring and Lift. So the ring track was called as such because it generally stayed on the B1 ring, which was just the backstage under-seating area on the edges of the VOMs that just circled the entire stage. And lift track was lift track because it was ferrying artists between the maybe 4 performer levels. So B1, level 4, level 8, and level 6 didn't have the lift. That's right. We used the stairs for that one. But mostly ferrying people up and down, and also technicians as well that needed to get quick to different queues. Specifically for moto, so same thing as roller, we're queuing the bikes to go into the VOM, so they have a visual and the oral from the caller. As soon as we hear that rider down, we're up with the X signal. And as soon as that B1, as soon as the clear to respond comes from the show caller, both ring and the lift track people would get out of their little kind of makeshift, what were they, like little platforms above the pool, because we had to stand inside under the seating because we couldn't stand in the middle of the ring. So the roller had a little bit more space, but it was still quite tight. So we'd come out of our little cages, grab emergency equipment, and then run straight to the source of the accident with equipment. And we would then straight away take over from any hands-on stuff from the B1 North lead, so that they could communicate more with the other tracks and the show caller and be more present with for supporting performer wellness as well. We could just take anything off their hands. Usually we had so many carpenters and riggers that were also helping us, wardrobe as well, that the 2 stage management tracks were a little bit hands-off-ish as well. So generally we would then maybe corral artists, make sure everyone's okay in the different aqua coolies, the aquatic entrances that were between the VOMs under the seating. So we kind of would do a lap around the ring once things kind of settled down a bit and start to kind of move people into the pins that they needed to be for a restart, or gathering everyone at B1 North or wherever people needed to be gathered, and just kind of help and assist with that kind of stuff as well. But the X and then getting that equipment to the place was the quickest. That was the first thing to come.
So back in the booth, after all that, well, that's happening, and we've got him clear to respond. Then show callers putting up the house lights, running the announcements to say, hey, we've stopped the show, which comes in 3 languages because we've generally got a number of, languages speaking people in the audience. So have announcement, assisting in any work light that's required up on B1 North, because generally it's usually dark up there, so adding light to there. And then one of the considerations was that if there was an accident on stage is visibility. So we would, should we consider an evacuation of audience or not? Generally that I never had to do that, but it was one of the points that you'd have to consider. And then also have the director on duty come to the booth and discuss, how much we're seeing, how serious is it, are the cast affected, are we all affected? Let's just make some big macro decisions on the appropriateness to continue this show given the circumstances. Now, fortunately, most of the accidents that we had were not so bad that, we couldn't continue. Yes, maybe they've broken something, but they've got to go to the emergency and get that set or something. But it's not so amazingly or messy or anything that it's something that we couldn't continue. And then what I would do is, while all those guys are backstage running around doing their thing and attending to the person, we would take an assessment of where we're going to restart the show, which generally would begin with the striking the moto act and kicking on from there. So that's what I would do. And then meanwhile, it'd probably be back to, then I really handed over, once I've done all that periphery stuff, I handed over for Rex to lead as the B1 North person to tell me how long they're going to take, what they need, blah, 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 blah. So the show caller really then takes a back seat and lets the B1 North manage that situation. So just to, I think we could continue to talk to get away out of it. We're already at 10:36. So I just wanted to go and show you guys the little slide that shows you how the practical way. This is actually a 1 page, but I've broken it up into 3 so you can see the 3 stages of show stops. So this is how we broke down from a paperwork perspective what we just discussed. So what we discussed sounds really complex, but in the reality, you can put this on 1 page. So this is what it looks like. So there's the first page. Show caller stops the act, checks writer stops writing, clear to respond. Here's what the B1 North one does, what roller, ring and lift do, what level 4 does the code red radio call. That's step 1. Step 2 is show caller does those 4 things, B1 North does those things, roller track, a level 4 have their roles, does their things. And that's how we start to respond to the situation. And then the third step is, once incident is controlled and contained enough to continue the show, they're the steps that we use to continue the show. So that's a 1 pager. So when we train stage managers in this situation, we begin with this. We explain each other's roles, and then we rehearse this a number of times so that when it happens in the real life situation, we're ready to go. Like I said, if B1 North, if somebody was new to B1 North and wasn't used to taking the lead, maybe sometimes somebody would come and assist with that, because that is a role that has a high responsibility in an incident situation. So that's really the way that we smash that on out. All right, so we have got so many questions, I'm sure, Rex, and we're already at 10:38. So let's go through the major questions, Rex, and if everybody's still happy, we'll kick on till 11 answering these questions, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Would you stop the show if there was a situation at front of house and if an audience member is unwell? I don't think we ever did at House of Dancing Water, but I have stopped a show for an audience incident before.
Yeah.
We actually had an incident where an audience member reacted in a quite a negative way, health-wise, from seeing actually quite a minor incident on stage, in my experience as well. So that was from one single thing to respond to turned into obviously a dual medical emergency that required different sets of teams, different requirements in terms of lighting and assistance, and it just kind of got a lot more complicated. And that I'd never actually really thought about that, and I'd never had that rehearsed either. So it kind of but the way it rolled out felt very, very natural, and it was definitely not fearful of the situation. It felt of like a very natural and common sense kind of way to respond to those kinds of things when they just kind of come at you in that way.
There was a first aid room for front of house in the theatre, and generally front of house would definitely deal on a case-by-case basis for people that had issues. Most of the time, from memory, the issues where people had a health incident or anything, it would be more at the end of the show, and that's when we were alerted that something was going on. So I don't think there's been anything mid-show. I mean, my favourite audience thing it's got nothing to do with injuries, but I'm going to say it anyway, was one day I was doing like a spotting the boat, and I saw this guy who had a laptop and he had Skype on it, and his friend was watching through Skype. So he's literally turned the laptop and faced around the stage. So you see this guy and then a laptop and then this full head of Skype watching the show. So I thought that was really, they always say no phones and no screens, but in Asia, that's like an unstoppable dream, really. So.
Next question from Spencer. How far into a hold or stop would you remove performers on standby underwater? How did you effectively communicate to them when they can't hear and have impaired vision?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, first of all, we've got paging under the water, so we can always speak to them, and the aquatic show caller can speak to them. Generally, in a show stop situation, if we were vamping and continue, I don't know, I mean, maybe you guys may have some other examples, but if we're vamping and trying to continue the show, we're going to leave them under there. But if we're going to stop, they're going to come back out. Knowing that you're going to pull all those people out from underwater, that you've got a huge setup to get going again. So it's a judgment call really on your behalf. And you could be wrong, right? You could be like, okay, and you might hear it from the cast afterwards. You left us underwater for 5 minutes and I wasn't happy. So that's a potential. So you've got to really make that judgment call depending on the situation. Would you guys agree?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, whenever I stopped, I had a little piece of paper beside me that said, do you have anyone in the air? Do you have anyone in a harness? Do you have anyone underwater? As a reminder to go, obviously you can see the people who are in the air. You're going to focus on them because they're right in front of you. But sometimes there's people at preset up on level 4 and level 6 that you can't necessarily see. And then there's also, you could have up to 20 people hanging out under the water waiting. Well, if you're talking about boat, 28 people under the water waiting for this, waiting to surface. So it's that constant reminder of, where are your people? And it's sort of a different situation. It was different for me when you're talking about 20 cast members waiting to go on from underwater for something like Stranded People, which is, 4 per aqua coolies with a couple of divers each, as opposed to a main character who's been caught by a diver and is working one-on-one with a specific person. I'd probably be more likely to leave the Jean character with his diver if I knew it was only going to be a short period of time, because I knew he was okay with that. But I also knew some of the other Arnies weren't happy to hang out underwater for any length of time if they didn't have to. So it was knowing who the people were, if they were with an individual diver or if they were just waiting with a cast group. And I think that really affected my decisions.
Yeah. I remember one of the caveats as well that we had to consider calling, if we were going into moto still, and planning to go into moto, if we stopped the show and then decided to take artists out of the water, we could very potentially wet the B1 ring so much that we couldn't dry it in time for moto. So we'd have to often try and keep them underwater for a little while until we knew that we really couldn't continue in any way, and then we'd get them out of the water. Otherwise, we'd have to think further down the track and go, okay, are we going to have more time here in order to dry the ring for moto if I take people out of the water right now?
Yeah. Bray says, can you speak more about the aquatics show caller? So just to put it into context, there's 2 show callers in the show. So there's the main show caller, and the aquatic show caller mainly facilitates all of the movement underwater and clears it for the main show caller. So for example, they work with the aquatics team to put the scuba team to put the pagoda on the stage and set it into the center stage, and then they get out of the pool ring, and then they say, pagode's clear, or pagode's set, and so then we know we can bring it out of the water. So they do a real functional show calling aspect of the show that really coordinates all the underwater movement, and they communicate to 4 divers that have cameras and also the ability to communicate verbally back to the show caller to give clears and talk to them. So they have their own little network of organisation that then passes the essential information to the show caller for us to facilitate. So they manage all of the underwater performer handling and give us the clears for us to bring them out or put them in. Tom asks if this is a good question. Sorry to jump in because you're moderating the questions. If the divers were on tanks, did you have to consider how much air the divers have left? Never for shows, but that was a huge creation issue because we'd be in the pools for hours on end, and it would always be like, okay, we're going to do a sequence. Hang on, we're going to go fill the dive tanks up again. So that was something we really had to control and manage during creation. But during the show, generally they were all full tanked up for the show, and we that was never an issue during the running of the show.
Lisanne, sorry, I'm probably going to say her name wrong. Lisanne had a question about, she'd sent in a question via email. Anna, I'll leave that one to you.
Yes. She says, what if you're stepping into a show that's already been running and you find out there are no security or show stop measures in place? Where you think there really should be? How would you approach that kind of situation?
Well, you'd start writing some straight away, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I mean,
that would be so bad.
It's always a sensitive topic to highlight to people that there isn't adequate procedures there, and I think if you feel that there isn't enough safety around it, then you have to bring that up and gently introduce that conversation, especially because nobody wants to ever see anyone hurt or that, and maybe it just comes down to simple experience or people just don't know how to. And I would say for anything, like, learn how to write a standard operating procedure, learn how to do a risk assessment, learn how to do these things. Yes, they're boring things, but they're so essential. And when you've got a procedure, and that's why we always tried to make them very simple, 1-page rule of law, this is how we do it. Because when you write a 10-page document, nobody's going to read that. So you want to try and keep that information as simple and as practical as possible. And I would begin by starting, okay, the question is, if a person is flying in the air, how are you going to get them out? If somebody is in this situation and we have a fire, how are you going to get them out? How is you going to deal with those situations? So it's about looking around your theatre and looking around your things and spotting the potential dangers and having a contingency plan to eradicate that, to mitigate that risk. That's really what you have to do from start to finish in a training situation, in a show situation. And you could be, you don't want to be a doomsday prepper, right? Where you're like, if you could sit there and think about everything that could go wrong with a House of Dancing Water, I'd still be there writing standard operating procedures. But you've got to sit there and go, what is the most likely situation? And that's really the most important. What is the most likely, down to, you're not going to spend 50 hours writing an SOP on the grid falling in, because the chances of that happening is like super, super, super slim. But you are going to talk about how you're going to deal with somebody that's had a bad landing on Russian swing, because that's going to be a daily occurrence. So it's identifying what's possible and getting there and start doing it.
I'm coming back to Lisanne's question. Sorry to make it flippant at the start there, but I've come onto a lot of shows halfway through and coming into looking at their emergency procedures. Most shows you're going to come into have something in place. And if you come in a year, 6 months, even on after the first week, there's going to be kind of something in place. And certainly from experience, you can negotiate, you can make amendments, you can make suggestions on how to make things better. But the most critical thing is the bottom line, is how many seconds? How many seconds is that response going to take? And if you can shave a few seconds off your response here or there by suggesting a few things to the team that you've just come into starting working with, going, hey, what if we try this? We might save 10, 15 seconds. Because in these kind of accidents, every second really counts. If you can get to somebody 10 seconds quicker, then that's really important for that person to have a good outcome from an accident.
And I think also when you're talking about time, every second counts. Remembering also too that there's and this is going to sound probably really silly, but there's a really big difference between a person stuck in winches stopping and people in a harness who can still move, and an unconscious person in a harness, and that really ramps up the difference in your response. and prioritizes if you have several people in the air.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think remembering that not everyone comes from our background. Like, we have such a high level of emergency response training because we had to, because we were on this show. So I think sometimes when you're coming into a show that's not of this scale, remembering that not every stage manager has had this experience. So they're not necessarily thinking in that way. You're going to see things and see holes that potentially they're not going to see. So it's not necessarily that they don't care. It's just maybe they haven't realized. And so, like, I often do it where it's like, I'll ask it more as a question, like, hey, if this happens, what's your process for how you deal with this? And then that kind of is a nice way of them then realizing that they haven't thought about it without it being like, well, why isn't there a process, you know?
Anytime you spark conversation about it is a good thing.
Lizanne also has a wonderful question. I know we've discussed this probably at length, and that's about the artistic integrity of the show over finishing the show. Do you guys think there's all that uncomfortable giggle by everybody? I mean, who wants to talk about that? What do you want to say about artistic integrity over finishing a show?
As Anna said, when we dealt with that oil spill very early, like we've been open 2 months, I think. I remember that very well because that was the day my then fiance fell in the pool with his passport. We were supposed to be getting married in Australia 3 days later. Anyway, at that point in time, we weren't, we didn't have an option to do a no water version of the show. But as the time progressed, we were able to do a show that did remove a lot of the elements if visibility in the pool wasn't great or if there were other issues. And for me, I don't know how you guys all felt, but for me that was really difficult because from an artistic point of view, that's not the show that we created. That's not the show. That's not the show in its best light. That's not the show. That's not the show that we advertise. If you're talking about removing several key elements in the show, and it's not the show that we enjoyed doing. It's also not the show that the cast enjoyed doing. So that was a really difficult thing where we passionately believed that perhaps this was a show we couldn't do, but from another perspective, it was a show we still had to do because the desire was that the show still went on.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's
pride. Because you've got so much pride in like presenting a full perfect show, but also pride in presenting a show that isn't 100% perfect, that is compromised in some way. Actually getting the show up and getting it through. I mean, I have to say, like, it's not Shakespeare. It is a piece of spectacle theatre, and the promoter was the one most of the time who was pushing us to do a show in those compromised situations, less than ideal situations. With winches out, with lifts not working, with water visibility compromised. They're the ones who want to get the show out in that condition. Franco might have a different sort of idea on that, but that's not the reason the show was created. It wasn't created it was there to entertain people coming to Macau to go to the casinos. Like, you've got to look at each show. If it was Shakespeare, then it would be a different story. You'd have to preserve the timeline. If you had to stop a Shakespeare show, you would have to pick up from where you started. You pick up exactly from where you finished. Whereas House, you chop and change, you get through to the end and go, oh, thank God that's over, And
there was a pride in doing a modified show because it was the challenge of doing something you'd never done. And, I really strongly believe that I'm a far stronger show caller from being a caller on House Dancing Water because it taught me to really think outside the box. You come across a problem in the show and you're like, oh, is this a stop? Is it not? The stage manager, me as a stage manager 12 months ago would have definitely stopped. Now I know I can work around until we get to here and the problem's either fixed or then we have to stop. There's one of the most challenging things was in the, 600 or so shows that I called, it never got boring because there was always the challenge of something. There was always the what's going to happen next and always the reminder that there was never a dull day. Let's just say that. There was always something funky going on, whether it's, a scheduling issue or a technical issue with the show, or a new person going on for the first time in a lead role, new operators going in, which was always really exciting, and it kept me interested for a good 7 years. So
yeah,
I want to tack onto that a little bit as well, Rex, because I noticed there was quite a heavy question a bit early in the run about
I didn't get back to that one. Yeah,
dealing with stress and responses to stuff that can be quite tragic, and it's a really, really heavy question to dive into, and I don't know if that's something we can do now, especially given time, but just the way that you were explaining all of those challenges on a show that was really, really challenging and quite daunting for people to come into and start calling, obviously depending on whatever experience they came from, but having that attitude that you just presented there, the way that you explained those challenges, like akin to like being proud of achieving those things and actually moving towards conquering these challenges and kind of working through the complications and really trying to understand it and be excited about it. For me, I just wanted to add that is like, for me, number one on the list of like dealing with stress is just make it into something that you enjoy. Really turn it into a joy. That just triggered that, so I wanted to throw that in.
Yeah. Something that I remembered is, you know, when you did return back to the office from the booth and you had one of those shows that's like squeezing toothpaste back into a tube, and the lifts have stopped all the time, and you've had sometimes you have 3 or 4 show stops during a show, and you just can't. You know what it's like. You just can't get it going.
I love that analogy.
Putting toothpaste back in the
Some of it was like that. It's a 90-minute show, and sometimes it would feel like 25 minutes long, and it'd just be going and going and going and be super exciting. And sometimes it would feel like it took 2.5 hours to get from the start to the finish of that thing, because every time you call a lift queue, lifts have stopped. Okay. We've got them back. Okay, so everything's just always a little bit behind all the time, but you just have to keep pushing.
Keeps you on the edge, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I like talking on that, like, I think, you know, this was the first professional show I ever called. Ridiculous. And, you know, I think we spoke about this offline, but like, I think it was a good, like, 6 months before I didn't feel like physically nauseous calling the show, like just with the magnitude, you know, and I'd been at the show for 2 years or so before I started calling it, and knew the show like quite intimately through like moving up through the ranks, and, you know, so it's really like, it was really daunting for like quite a long time. And I think you had to have this really fine line between being confident but never being cocky, because this show could really throw anything at you. And I think, like, you know, when I talk about this show now to people, you know, you can be quite flippant about it, but the reality was that you could really, really hurt someone, and you could really hurt someone directly in what you were doing as a show caller, not like through them having an accident in the air or all of the other magnitude of things that were happening, but actually through you saying go on a cue could really physically hurt someone. And I think like it took quite a long time for me to feel comfortable with that responsibility, but never fully, like always on that edge of aware of what the show was.
Yeah, it's very, very important.
Yeah, what I was going to say is when you did have those tough calls, you'd come back into the office after that, and the whole team would give you a round of applause. And those kind of things are really nice to celebrate, because they're your peers. They know how hard that job just was. They know that you got it through that, and to celebrate that together as a team, I think it's really important for those big teams to come together and do that. It puts you in a good place when you've just had a pretty full-on experience calling like some of those full-on shows. It's nice when you come together after that and celebrate that. You know,
we lived.
Yeah, we got through it.
Well, Lisanne has one good question, which I think we should touch on as well, which is, have you ever received backlash or negative feedback after you've had to stop a show, and how did you handle that? And that's very multifaceted. Did we have backlash from technical or artistic or producing or artistic direction? You know, and that can come in. That's the tough position, I think, as a show caller, because a lot of the time, many people, especially cast who may have come from sports acrobatics or gymnastics, have little clue as to what your responsibilities and roles are. And the way that we generally approached it, as I said, we used to have post-show meetings very early on in the start of the shows, In the first 2 years, it was very rock and roll. We didn't have our standard operating procedures. We'd have situations. Dean, Rex, or I would make decisions on the fly. We would do our best to navigate through the issues that we have. And sometimes we didn't always make the right decisions. And sometimes people were left underwater for too long. And sometimes people were left in the air for too long. And sometimes the point that we picked up wasn't the ideal time to pick up. So basically the way that I approached it really as the general stage manager was to hopefully defend my team in all the situations, because I trained my team, and so I'm responsible for any mistake they make. I don't want them to be targeting that person. It's us as a team. And generally we would go back to a meeting with the cast and we would say, look, this is the situation. These are the decisions that we made. This is what we've learned from it. And this is how we're going to move forward. And you need to accept that we're on this path of trying to navigate as well. And I think mostly I would say transparency and honesty always wins. And we can make mistakes because we're human too. And if you're honest and treat them with respect and give them all the information, then they will start to trust you. And when they trust you, then you can work through anything together. And it goes the same with the technical team. Often we would bring the technical team in to explain technically what was happening with the show so that they could understand. And some of them didn't care, and some of them didn't really want to know, but they just wanted to feel that they were being heard, you know, and that was really the way that we would deal with it. Did we always win that? No, but we had to earn that back each and every time that people sort of questioned our procedures and our things. And I think we navigated pretty well in the first few years through that until we had our procedures, and then we could just nail it. We're like, okay, well, this is what we do in this situation, and this is what we do in this situation, and then they come participatory in it. The cast always had their own onus and responsibility as well. They had to check their harness, they had to check their things, they had to look for the green light. They were not receivers of the show call, they were participants in it, and so it wasn't like us versus them. It was a team working together to run the show. All right, hit 11 o'clock. Let's go for a few more questions, Rex, before we shut down, because I think we could go forever. I think
yeah, I think we probably could. Someone Donna just asked about lineup, and I suggested perhaps that's a whole other webinar because
no,
that's a good hour's conversation to start off with.
Oh, we could show, and maybe Mads, you could explain the front page of the lineup, just so you could explain how information was communicated to the cast. I think that's probably useful. You want to do that?
Yes. So just quickly, the lineup was a 24-page document. I think it's been condensed now. That was issued on a daily basis per show. It was created by stage management and the artistic team, and then distributed to technical departments and the artists, because the show, unlike musicals or theatre, doesn't have set tracks or doesn't have set roles, or the cast, they're in profiles and they know certain acts and they get rotated through those acts on a daily basis. So this is the front page of one of the lineups. So you can tell in the middle section where it says continuing and special bow, that was kind of where we had all our main technical information. So anything that wasn't working or was cut, or if we were doing one of the show alternates. So in this version, you can see we're doing a special bow, which is an alternate version of the show. So the basic list of what that is then put into the lineup. And then down the bottom in the boxes and on the side in the boxes, that's our general information that we would give, that the cast and technical departments would use every day to know the basics of what was happening in the act. So they could kind of see it all in one page as a summary, and then they could go to a particular page for that act and then see the individual details. So for example, we were talking earlier about the Straps act and how there was a 5-person version and a 7-person version. So in the bottom box where it says daughters, you can see about halfway down it says Straps, and it says that the Straps is a 5-person for that day. So you as the show caller would have a look through and see what affected you, the technical departments would see what affected them, the cast would see what would affect them, and then go to the individual pages. So there's quite a lot of information that's given, especially on that front page. And when we would do our announcements, like our calls before the show, we would also announce certain information as well, so that was then also sent around the building. Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go.
Nice.
One of the last questions that I skipped, sorry, was having called House of Dancing Water, does it make it easier or harder to call, other shows like Cirque shows?
Good question.
I think every show is different.
Yeah, every show is different. Every show has its challenges, and you can't be as arrogant to say, I've called House of Dancing Water, therefore everything's easy. Because at the end of the day, you've still got people's lives at the other end of a winch line, or even if it's only one winch line as opposed to 17 winch lines, it's still the same thing. You've got to be as cautious, as on it, as precise.
What it does do is give you an awareness of lots of factors and a preparedness, I think. And I think that's the great learning experience from
and
doing
the confidence,
that,
and confidence as well.
Yeah, confidence, like as I was saying to you guys recently, I was in Dubai and had to call an arena show, and 2 days before they turn up with a SWAT team, we said, we want to fly a SWAT team out of the middle of the grid with a dog. And I'm like,
cool.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
And we did it, and it wasn't a big deal to do that because I've got so much experience with flying people out of the air and blah, 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 blah. So, but whereas I can imagine, 12 years ago, that somebody coming to me to that would stress me out, and I would have been so anxious about trying to facilitate that. So, I think getting yourself as much experience as possible in all of those realms really, really helps your confidence as a caller, as somebody who's got to coordinate, and somebody who's got to create stuff. It gives you the ability to be able to create things as well.
I think on the opposite side, I had quite a unique experience because I went from one Dragon water show to another Dragon water show that, possibly like some of the most similar types of shows. You think they would be so similar, but they're so completely different. But also I think the advantage that we had at House was that we had quite a lot of technology in terms of in the booth, in terms of the call itself. We had a lot of cameras, we had a lot of, we had a really great comm system, we had direct access to talk to a lot of different departments. We had, stage management had its own comms line. So it was really interesting for me, in some ways, because that was the first show I called, to go back to a lesser scale of technology itself in your actual show call was really difficult, to not have a private stage management line to be able to talk to stage management directly, to not have I've worked on musicals now where you have a camera that literally, if the lights are on, it's so the light bleed is so much that you actually can't see what's happening in the middle of the stage, or, also when we called House, we literally called it from the booth facing the stage. When you call musicals, you're generally in a corner calling off screens with 60 cast standing next to you singing in your ear. So, in some ways, we had quite a lot of advantages that then going into different parts of theatre, I was like, oh, I don't have the luxury of having this quiet operator sitting next to me. I've now got children screaming at me, so and I can't really see what's happening on stage. So I had to learn how to adapt the other way, where I was like,
Devolve.
oh, all of these things that I used to be able to see and do, I now can't.
That's true. All right, Rex, a couple more, and then we better finish up. It's already 11.
Okay, give me 2 seconds. I just jumped back to the top for some reason. Somebody, I can't remember who, but somebody asked how many show stops do we have on an average month/year, whichever was easier.
God.
That
depends on the month. Depends on the year.
Yeah.
It depends.
How far away is the
2013 was a bad year, that one. On average, I had worked out over the time that I was there, I'd done about 250, been involved in about 250 show stops. So that's across 7 years. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, what classifies a stop? We'd have a problem and we devamped and we kept going, or did we really stop and cancellations and stuff like that? It was, suffice to say, it was regular. It was in any given week, you would be dealing with something, and it may not have been a show stop, but you would have been dealing with potential things that could have stopped the show. And some things you could get around without stopping, and some things you could never do. But that's why it's, you never had time to be complacent, that's for sure. And actually, when you did get a smooth show, you'd be rocking out of the booth going, yep, everything went well, let's go.
So, well, it's also, how often did you have a smooth show that was a full show call. Like, you know, like it's not just show stops, but like we would know in advance a lot of the times that we were going to have problems. So we were already on our alternates. So like I can probably count on two hands the number of times I had a smooth show and called the full prompt copy.
Yeah. All right, Rex.
Scott asked, how do you deal with training of a new SM if you have a high turnover? How much do you train them before you start handing responsibilities over?
That's a really, really, really good question. And I feel like the reason that I ended up interviewing people and be like, are you coming for 2 years or are you not coming for 2 years, was really a big discussion, because it really would take 9 months for a person walking in the door to be an effective stage manager. And unfortunately, I mean, you know, and not to say that we did things the right way or the wrong way or anything. Maybe that could have been more efficient. Maybe we could have done it. But often you're first and foremost a service to the show, a service to the artistic team, a service to the technical team. And so often our training and our cross-training became secondary to delivering the show. So while I'd like to rotate people through the lineup or the schedule or the training sessions, realistically, we needed to still deliver, and it wasn't a training ground, right? So we'd have to fit that in as a corner piece to the management of the department. So, but generally, you know, we had an onboarding procedure for stage managers. We had a way that we wanted them to see and reveal the show to them. We always had to pull them back and say, don't try and manage the world right now. Just learn for the first 8 to 9 weeks so that you start to accumulate the knowledge to be effective, and then start to put them in trainings, start them with the easy trainings, start them with the easy tracks, and then load on the more complex trainings, load on the more complex tracks, load on the ability to learn and execute the schedule once they know enough about the way that the building works. Once they know enough about the show, begin to train them into the lineup. Once they've done all of those layers of learning, then they go up into the possibility of being able to call the show, and we start that process. But really from start to finish, from walking in, you know, an ASM could be fully integrated within a few months, but a stage manager is going to take about a 9-month period to be fully effective. So when you want somebody to come in, I want you to be there for 2 years, because, you know, if I train you for 9 months and you're gone after 12, that hurts us. That hurts us a lot. We put a lot of effort and a lot of time, and the other people in the team have to work on other things while you do your training. If you're learning to do the schedule and it takes you 3 months to learn the schedule, nobody else gets to do it, right? So we're adjusting around your learning as a team. And so that was always a really interesting balance to maintain as a manager. And we didn't please everybody all the time, that's for sure.
I think we also had a bit of a advantage in Macau as well, because we were a team of 8 to 9, depending on the time, and we only needed 6 people to run the show. So we had quite a lot of time where we could have people in the office, or we could have cross-training. You know, not every show has that advantage. Like, I've been on shows where I've been hired as a show caller, so the necessity for me to call the show is like immediate. It's like you need to be up and running. They don't have, you know, or someone's leaving and you're going to be the predominant show caller, so you need to be calling that show, and they may only be leaving in 3 to 4 weeks. So sometimes, like in other situations, it's been like the priority has to be on learning the show call, and then you learn some of the other admin things on top of that. You know, we were lucky in Macau that we really had the time, and obviously the nature of the show as well, to slowly like integrate people over time. I think unfortunately on a lot of other shows that you don't always have that advantage.
And that was important though, because the ultimate thing is that the premise is to keep people safe. So you have to be an effective person to you know, effective stage manager to keep people safe. So we wanted to not put you in a situation where you're going to endanger yourself or others by going too hard too fast, you know. Sorry, go ahead, Rex.
I'm just trying to find Adam's question again. So Adam, apologies, I mightn't phrase it exactly as you did. Adam had a question about how as a show caller you deal with stress and anxiety when you're calling show stops and making those big decisions. And I said, I quickly replied to him saying it's, from my point of view, it's very personal. And I think the more that you do it, the more you become comfortable with making some of those big decisions. But I think I'm pretty superstitious, and I know Dean is too. You know, we both had a little process we did before the show that made us feel comfortable about doing the, you know, standing in that position and being the show caller. I stand as a show caller so that if I do start to feel stress, which obviously comes out in your body, that I can move to like physically go, okay, calm down. Like that makes a really big difference to me. Don't know how that's going to work with Harry Potter. I don't think I can stand. I don't think I can see if I stand. So I think everybody's got a very different process. I also said debriefs were very important to me. I needed to be able to go and talk to another experienced show caller about what my decision making had been and if they would have done it differently, or you know, if there was a better way we could streamline things.
What about you guys?
Yeah, I think there's a host of mental gymnastics that I go through when I'm feeling different things in my mind or my body, or depending on the day, depending on the situation and stuff. But two things that definitely come to mind first in terms of tools that are like at the forefront of my mind for stress management, for sure. One would be the concept that when like having a certain level of awareness. So when we're in our bedrooms and we're reading a book and it's an hour before bedtime, like our level of reactionary awareness is zero. Like there's no threat, there's no danger, like there's nothing we have to be aware of. But then when we walk into a certain situation, like a standard training, a standard regular training, that level of awareness can consciously be elevated. So you're telling yourself, this is not the time to relax, but this is also not the time to be terrified that the sky is going to fall. So like finding a happy medium of, I'm going to walk into this room with a level of awareness that's going to put me in a position that's going to allow me to react from that new seat of where I've placed myself mentally. And then when I'm going into a show, it's elevated slightly, but it's not waiting for something to happen. It's, I'm going to do all the preparations in terms of understanding and knowing the show the best that I can, and having had conversations with different departments throughout the day to see how their systems are doing, or if there have been certain things going a bit funky throughout the week, like touching base and understanding those things. But then, you know, elevating myself to another level of awareness of like, okay, I know that we're having issues with this apparatus at the moment. When that scene comes, I'm just going to elevate myself a little bit and be a bit more aware. So being really kind of conscious of how we can kind of somehow control the way that our body moves up and down through these levels of awareness, so that when we get hit with something sudden, it's not a shock from 0 to 100. You're going from 40 to 100. And then that acceleration of awareness doesn't knock you back. And so the heat or the sweat or the breathing or the dry mouth, like the stuff that you're so viscerally aware of when you start to become stressed, is already something that you're anticipating, because you've put yourself in a place where when it starts to come, it's like, oh yeah, I feel that way because this is happening, and that's a totally normal reaction. The second thing that has really helped me has been understanding through my like independent research how the sympathetic nervous system works in terms of what actually happens to the body when it starts to experience stress, in terms of adrenaline, in terms of the reaction of certain glands and hormones and that kind of stuff, and understanding that to a level where I kind of feel like I have this thing of stress actually allows us to make really, really acute decisions. And so in a way, stress can be a show caller's best friend, because it turns you into like a decision-making maniac, where you're just like, I am tuned to make this decision right now, and my body is allowing me to be ready to make it quickly. But being a friend to that and approaching it with understanding and research has definitely helped me to love the feeling in a way, not in a masochistic sense, but like to be a friend to that experience rather than have it be something that really throws me off or something that I dread going to the booth. It's something now that's just an accepted awareness of what everything entails. That's where I'm at with it at the moment.
Super interesting.
Yeah, it's really astute.
What about you, Dean? Dean, Mads?
I was thinking, Rex and I, we're always because we had the luxury of the big team and it's a big show, and some days we'd come in and we'd talk to each other and go, I don't feel it today. I don't feel that I have a call in me today. And we'd always, whenever we had that, we'd always swap call with each other. And I think that was quite important. But I will say that whenever we did that, there'd be a show stop.
I remember the curse.
Every single time.
I used to rock up on the booth and the operators would be like, is this your show?
Don't mess with the rock
Dean. It's Dean's. And they're like, I was like, oh no, this is Dean's. And they'd be like, out. Go swap back. We're not dealing with this. Yeah. Yeah, I was cursed for a while.
I think for me is like, You just need to be really solid as a person prior to even stepping into show calling. And the exposure and repetition, as Rex said, is obviously a compounding effect. But I feel like you need to know that you are a confident person. Any underlying issues of you as a person, any insecurities that you might have, any worries, any relationship issues that you might have with teams around you or anything, all these factors weigh up to your confidence and an ability to lead. And really, I say try to eradicate all of the external factors that give that undermine your confidence as a caller, whether that be to work on your own personal confidence, any issues you may have in the past. It comes back to being, were you abused as a child? Was there, a fractured family situation? Were you not, what your level of education was? Awareness of where your place in the world and where your weaknesses are, and to bring them up to as strong as possible place that you can, cultivating the relationships around you, cultivating your relationships with the cast, cultivating a relationship with your team, that the amount of times that in the first 12 months that I had the technical team and the cast help us navigate through that because of our relationships gave me the confidence to be able to navigate with them and make decisive decisions because they were right there alongside us. So yes, exposure, yes, training, yes, get yourself on big shows, but really work on yourself and make sure that, I know I'm a decisive person and I've built that over time, and that's where that confidence comes. I'm very fortunate. I've come from a very fortunate, stable background. I know other people who have, come into experience as stage managers that I've worked with have underlying issues from their own upbringing. And that itself can be sabotage your ability to get in the booth and call. So be really aware of those things and work on them. Mads, you?
Yeah, I think just to talk to something in the immediate, like I have a big thing where I'm a dweller. So like I'm very aware of that. So I will find that, and a bit of a perfectionist. So I find that I had a big problem when I first started calling, that if I made a mistake, that it would really affect the rest of my show call. And so I had to make a really conscious decision about that very early on, and because I quickly noticed that if I made a mistake and I dwelt on it, then I would make more mistakes, because it's like, especially a show like House, you have to be so present all the time. And so, I have a thing now where like I will just write it down, or I'll make a note, or I'll do, like something physical to get it out of my head. So that I'm not thinking about that, and that I also have a tendency, to be thinking about a lot of other things that are happening as well. So like, I'll have this moment in the booth when I'm show calling where I'm like, oh, that's scheduled tomorrow. If I move this thing here, then, so it's the same thing. Like I have to get those thoughts out of my head. And so like I have a process where if I think of something or I make a mistake, I make a process of writing it down. So I know it's still there, but it's not in my immediate and it's not in my present, so that I can be fully present in the show that's happening,
Yeah, I did
dwell on it later.
Like, put it in a box and put it aside, or you compound the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you really
especially with the mistake.
Compartmentalize it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think that's everybody, even for me, like when you make a mistake, you're like, damn it. Okay, move on, drop it. All right,
I have
cool.
so many superstitions. Sorry, I just saw that top question and I was like, I have so many, like I think I spent too much time with Dean and Rex because like, I like on my most recent show, like I would sit and stand in like, because I couldn't stand for the whole 3 hours. I was losing it. I stood at the beginning, but like I have set points where I stood and sat during the show, to the point that it was in the prompt, like it was in my prompt copy. And people would always laugh at me because they're like, it says stand. I'm like, yeah, this is the part where I stand up. Like, so I think that like a lot of us by nature are quite superstitious. And I think a lot of it comes from House, because you're like, oh, I've done it the same way so many times and I feel confident when I do that. So I'm going to just keep doing that.
I think it took me three years not to have 3 perfectly sharpened pencils sitting right in front of me on the desk. And that was my little thing for about 3 years, but don't have to do that anymore.
to this day, I have to hold a pencil when I call. I don't know why.
Me too.
With creation or whatever, I can't call the show with nothing in my hand. I cannot do it. I have to have a pencil.
I always do too.
Just sit there with it. That's it.
I literally never broke the habits of having to run a video call of straps before I called the show. Took like 7 years of calling, could not break that habit. And the one time I did it, I felt so uncomfortable for the whole show that I was like, nah, not doing that again. Like, even if I just listened to the first 30 seconds of the music, preferably the whole act, but I just needed to be able to call it in my head before I did it with the people. It sounds so stupid, but it was just a thing. And I tried to break it and didn't.
All right, I think we should wrap up now because it's almost 2.5 hours. So thank you so much, guys. I will put my email address in here again. If you'd like to send me any more questions, I'll do my best to answer them to you. And thank you again for joining us. We've had another great turnout for this webinar. And thank you, Dean, Mads, Rex and Nathan for joining me again. Really appreciate it. And it's so good to see your faces. And we'll see you again. We've got a few more webinars coming up in the next few weeks. They'll be announced this week. There's one on contract negotiation on Thursday with Terence Williams, who is a very experienced producer, ex-stage manager, who writes about 250 to 300 contracts a year, and he wants to teach you how to negotiate your contracts. So join us for that one, which will be really interesting. I'm going to be there watching as well, and hopefully when you're in your next situation to negotiate a contract, you can have all the tools for that. We're going to do some on sports presentations, ceremonies, branching out into other types of genres of show calling. So keep an eye on TheatreArtLife for the upcoming stuff. And thank you again for joining us. And thanks, guys.
For sure.
See you guys.
See you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.